Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. I'm still here, still healthy as best as I can tell. Same with everybody in my family. Here's hoping that keeps up. And I hope all of you are staying healthy and not doing anything dumb like running around to parties or attending church services like I hear some people are doing. So this week I'm going to give out a lot of Facepalm and Sigh awards to people who've been saying and writing some relatively stupid things in regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. If you've been a listener for any length of time, you know that there was a while back, it was episode 37, I did a whole episode that was just Facepalm and Sigh awards, and that one was devoted to one of the Democratic presidential primary debates because, well, you get a bunch of politicians running for president, they're bound to say some, well, not only some really dumb things, but some pretty logically fallacious things, and so that was pretty fun to do. And there's just been a lot of very, very bad reasoning going around about this pandemic. And so I selected some articles that I thought were pretty good examples of that, or some speeches, stuff that people have been saying, and I'm going to go through and explain why it's bad reasoning. Now again, I'll add a caveat here that with this pandemic, there are a lot of unknowns and variables. So I think it was on Monday of this week, which would be March 30th, if I'm getting the dates right. It might have been the 31st or the 1st of April, but somewhere this week, the White House announced they're expecting anywhere between 100,000 and 240,000 Americans to die as a result of that. Well, that's a lot, and it's bad, but there's a wide variability in the data there. One is over two times as many as the other. And so even official numbers, there's a wide variability in the data. And so I'm going to try and not critique people so much for the fact that there's a lot of unknowns in this. Some of the data disagrees with each other. Some people who are experts in the field say it's going to be very, very bad. Some people who are experts in the field seem to say, well, it's going to be bad, but it's not going to be that bad. There's variability in the data. And when there's variability there and there's unknowns, that naturally will enable people to kind of see different narratives and at least somewhat be justified in doing that, have a little bit of warrant in that. And just using this as because it's an easy example, but when the official government source puts out that it's going to be between 100,000 and 240,000 people, hey, variability in the data there, so that means more or less if you're not an expert on this and you aren't trained in these matters and you don't have access to the data or better data than the White House does, you're justified in saying, well, it's somewhere in this range, but I don't know which. And then in theory, you could, if you get a little more information, you might be justified in saying, well, I think it's on the high end, or somebody else might think it's on the low end. And that's the trouble with having a lot of unknowns and variability in the data. So I'm not going to try and critique people for that so much, although you actually can slip into a bit of a logical fallacy there that some people have, and I'll get into that. That's the fallacy of cherry picking, where you pick the data that suits your narrative and ignore all the other data. And there are a lot of people doing that. I think I found an example or two of that. But anyhow, that's what I'm going to be doing this week. And I'm going to get started with an article by a guy named Aaron Ginn. I think that's how you pronounce his name. It's spelled Ginn. He wrote an article that was doing the rounds on social media about, I want to say a week or two ago. Well, I know I saw a lot of people sharing this. It was called Evidence Over Hysteria -COVID-19. And so I'm sure you saw this. Many people did. Well, this is a pretty bad article that's actually filled with a lot of very, very fallacious reasoning. Now, it was originally put up on medium.com, which is more or less a site for where people can write anything. And then it actually got taken down from Medium because a lot of people who are experts in the field were going through debunking that. A guy named Carl T. Bergstrom, Bergstrom, went through and debunked a lot of it, and I guess that Bergstrom is an actual biologist with training in it and who was able to say, no, this guy Ginn has no idea what he's talking about. You shouldn't be listening to him. Well, you can, even though Medium took it down, you can still find the article on zerohedge.com if you want to read it. So, and I don't recommend you read it because it's actually not very well reasoned. even though as a layman in disease studies, medicine, and biology, you could be forgiven for thinking that because a lot of its errors are cloaked and it's written in such a way that it has an appearance of authenticity even though it doesn't have that. But really, if you read it closely, even people who aren't trained in these fields should have been able to pick that out. So essentially, the point of Jin's article here was that he's claiming that, well, this is something that we should be concerned about and take seriously. Really, we're in panic mode, and we shouldn't be in panic mode. And this article was written, if I'm reading the date right, or at least posted originally back on March 20th. So that's only about 2 weeks ago now, just about 2 weeks ago, depending on when you're listening to this, which means that it's really spiraled completely out of control and is getting worse every day since he wrote that. Because as of when I'm recording this now, there's nearly 250,000 people in the United States who are confirmed to have been infected with the virus. So the number is naturally going to be much, much higher than that. And almost 6,000 people have died, which does lend, I would hope, less credibility to his claim that this was just panic. But you might want to say, well, that's hindsight. You're able to look back 2 weeks in the future from when this guy was writing it and say, well, you were wrong because I know more information than he did now. And that's kind of true. I heard somebody make a joke recently that hindsight is 20/20 when they were talking about these kind of things, which is pretty appropriate for this year. But really, there's as I said, quite a bit of stuff here in this article that's just wrong that should have been able to be picked up on. Now, first of all, he goes through very early on in the article and says that he's going to use sources from the CDC, the WHO, NIH, NHS, the universities of Oxford, Stanford, Harvard, and several other things. And all that sounds good. And then he says, and I quote him here, "I'm quite experienced at understanding virality, how things grow, and data. In my vacation, I'm known for popularizing the growth hacking movement in Silicon Valley that specializes in driving rapid and viral adaptation of technology products. Data is data. Our focus here isn't on treatments, but on numbers. You don't need a special degree to understand what data says and doesn't say. Numbers are universal." And there he just made his first two really should be big and obvious mistakes. First, when he says numbers are universal and data is data, well, no, it's absolutely not. That's really not the case at all. Context matters a great, great deal. If a time traveler came to me and gave me all of next year's detailed financial data on stocks and commodities, I mostly wouldn't know what to do with it because I have very little background knowledge and training on how those kind of things work. Now, I'm not an idiot. I could probably use it to make some money, but you give it to somebody who's a trained financial advisor or somebody with an MBA, they'd be able to make a lot better use of it than I can because they have the background training and the knowledge of how to do that. Same thing like when it comes to reading languages. If data was data, then context wouldn't matter. So you should be able to read every language because, hey, it's just data. You don't need special training to just go read ancient Egyptian or ancient Greek or French or some other language that you've never come across before, right? Well, no, that's not the case at all. Or take another example. If you were looking at, say, the complex physics involved in something like quantum physics or nuclear fission or any of these other things that physicists sometimes write out as equations, well, without the training and knowledge of physics or quantum physics, you're going to have a very, very hard time understanding that, even though it is data. Data is not just data. You need context in order to apply it. Now, very often that context will come in the form of training or some type of background knowledge so you know what you're talking about, so you have an idea of what it actually means. So here's a good example from archaeology and mythology that I heard of at one point. And I forget this one researcher's name. She was, I think, like a classical historian who was interested in the idea of, well, where did the Greeks get their mythology of like these monsters and these creatures, like the Cyclops? And she stumbled across an idea, and I don't remember exactly how. I saw a documentary on this one time, and I don't remember all the details. But the point was, she speculated, well, maybe what happened is that the Greeks saw these fossils of ancient creatures like dinosaurs and mastodons and so on and so forth, and from that concluded, oh, these are the remains of a great and terrible monster, which in the case of dinosaurs, hey, they kind of were. And in the case of the Cyclops, well, if you see a mastodon skull, the center of it is that will actually like break out where the trunk would go, and so it actually looks like a giant human skull with one eye if you don't have the requisite training in paleontology and knowledge that, there were ancient mastodons that were really big and lived all over the earth and things like that. So the point I'm making here is, in that example, you do have data that is data, which in that case would be the skull that the ancient Greeks, if this theory is right, saw, and we now see in contemporary museums and stuff. Well, we have the context and knowledge from other training and other knowledge we've looked at to know, that's not a Cyclops skull, that's a mastodon skull. The ancient Greeks did not have that context, they did not have that knowledge and training, so they looked at that skull and concluded, somewhat reasonably for them, this is the skull of a Cyclops, and naturally then it made its way into their mythology. So, point here is, data is not data. You need to have context and knowledge from which to interpret the data. Now, it's very easy to do that with simple data like my daughter when she sees colors. It's not so easy to do that with more complex and difficult data, like the statistics of a disease outbreak and its infectious rate and the rate at which it kills people and things along those lines. So there are many things that without the requisite background knowledge, you're going to have very little idea of what to do with the data and how to make sense of it. And that's part of the problem that you're seeing with a lot of articles and things that people are writing on this is very, very few of them are actually trained statisticians, trained people in medicine and disease spread and things like that, much less trained in all three. And they're all getting these varying amounts of data, and then they're kind of interpreting it based on what they want. And then they're interpreting it, but most of them don't have the background training or knowledge to make sense of it, as this guy doesn't. No, I don't have the background training or knowledge to make sense of a lot of this data either. And that's why I'm not going to try and reinterpret it for you either. But I do have the knowledge and training to be able to say what this guy's saying is wrong, because you just can't do that and say data is data. You need to be able to know what to do with the data that's given to you. This is kind of similar to a common objection that I'll often hear people level against Christianity, which they'll say, well, if Christ was really God and he's all knowledgeable, why didn't he give his disciples something that would be really, really useful, like advanced medical medicine and vaccines? Think of all the people's lives that could have saved. And that reminds me of a really great quote from Dallas Willard, where he's asked a similar question one time. He said, no, you might want to ask, why didn't Christ give his disciples the relativity theorem? And I would hope you should immediately realize the answer is they just wouldn't even know what to do with it, because understanding the relativity theorem requires a lot of background knowledge. And same thing with advanced medical knowledge like vaccines. They didn't even have the conception of microbes causing diseases back then. They didn't have the background knowledge to even make sense of that. Now, further, I hope you notice that he actually contradicted himself in this paragraph here, because what he actually tried to do is establish that his credentials, establish that he is an expert when he said in his vocation he's known for the growth hacking movement that specializes in rapid and viral adaptation. That is, he tried to say, I'm an expert on statistics on viral growth. Therefore, my expertise applies here. But then he immediately turned around and says, you don't need to have a special degree to understand what data says and it doesn't say. So, which is it? Do you have to be an expert or do you not have to be an expert? You can't have it both ways. You either need to be an expert to understand this or you don't need to be. Which is it? But on top of that, in establishing his expertise, because understanding how things go viral on the internet with technology is in no sense the same thing as understanding how an actual virus and plague, pandemic, etc., how that grows, how that spreads. It's not at all the same thing. Just because the word is similar, viral and virus, doesn't make it the same thing. So he's essentially starting off in this very first paragraph saying, hey, I'm an expert in these things, but he's actually not. So that's a fallacious appeal to authority, his own authority. And then he's saying, but you don't need to be an expert to understand these things. So he's already contradicted himself. Okay, so I'm rambling on about this article a little bit more than I intended to, so I'm just going to try and blow through the rest of the problems I saw. It's a fairly lengthy article, so I'm not going to quote it in detail. Go read it if you really like, but as I said, I don't recommend you do that. But if you feel like checking me to make sure I'm not taking him out of context or anything, you can certainly do that. Now, he did mention that numbers are universal, and here he's committing kind of a type of equivocation. Now, numbers are universal in the same sense that, say, an abstract like the color blue is a universal. I've talked about the problem of philosophical universals on this podcast a couple of times before, and that can get very deep into the metaphysic weeds, which we don't need to do right now. Rather, the point here is, just because a number is a universal, it doesn't follow that everyone, regardless of knowledge, education, or background, can make sense of them. You know, gravity is a universal. It's going to exist no matter where you are on Earth. Now, it doesn't follow from that anybody can understand how a rocket is going to use the slingshot effect from gravity to move around the moon or a planet or something like that. You need some background knowledge and education, math, and et cetera, to understand that. And so what he's doing there is essentially committing a type of equivocation where he's saying, well, because they're universal in this philosophical, metaphysical, and somewhat scientific sense, then they're universal in the sense that they're available to all human beings. They're like a universal right, like the right to life, or in America, the right to free speech. And those two are not the same things. That's a type of equivocation. Now, he also engages in the fallacy of cherry picking, which is something I've referred to before as choosing your own narrative. It's if you're a slightly older person like me, I'm 37, you might remember from your time in school that they used to have those choose your own adventure books where you could make a decision and it'd take you on a narrative depending on what choices you wanted the character to make. I got the phrase kind of from that. And the idea of choosing your own narrative is you go around, you look for data that supports what you want to think, then you cite the data that supports what you want to think, and you ignore any and all data that goes against you, that throws doubt on what you want to think, that says, oh, maybe there's something more going on here. And the technical term for this is cherry picking, which comes from the idea that you're going to the tree and you're just picking the cherries you want instead of getting the whole thing. Now, if you're going to do good thinking, reasoning, and good philosophy, social science, any kind of science, you can't just go pick the data you want. You need to do your best to look at all the data involved. And, of course, there's complexities and issues and problems involved with this because, you have to then try and cite, well, which data is relevant, whose data do I trust and whose data do I not trust? And so there's complexities and problems that come in with that, but you need to at least make a good faith effort to look at all the available data and then try and apply a consistent methodology or metric in order for which data you bring in. So an easy example of doing this that comes to mind because I've studied this a bit is very often people who are highly skeptical of Scripture will cherry pick data against Scripture and not apply the same methodology to other ancient data. I've talked about this before on the podcast, and you can go look it up yourself, but it's very commonly, widely known that the New Testament documents, and the Gospels especially, are the best attested ancient documents we have, in the sense of the number of manuscripts we have, the variety of the manuscripts we have, the geographical distribution of the manuscripts that we have, and so on and so forth. So if you were to compare those to other ancient documents like the stuff Julius Caesar wrote, the stuff Plato wrote, the stuff Aristotle wrote, and so on and so forth, the New Testament is just light years ahead as far as how certain we can be that we have what the Gospel authors and the other authors of the New Testament wrote. The evidence that shows us what the Gospel authors wrote, and that we do have that, is much, much stronger than the evidence that we have for, say, the works of Aristotle. And that's just undisputed among people who know these kind of things. And so often what you'll find people who are very skeptical of Scripture do is they just kind of ignore the fact that if they were applied the same metric, the same skepticism to other ancient documents that they do to the New Testament, they'd have to throw out basically all of classical history, because the documents we have, say, that tell us about the life of Alexander the Great, or Julius Caesar's accounts of his wars in Germania and Gaul, which are now Germany and France, much, much more in doubt than the New Testament documents. So they're not applying the same metric there, and that's my point. It's an example of cherry picking where they're like, well, I've got some real problems with what the New Testament says, so I'm going to look for the least little bit of skepticism I can find and apply that. Where in the case of other ancient documents that are more historical and less theological in nature, they don't do that. And the reason why is because the New Testament is not a narrative they want to look to, and they don't really care about the narrative that, say, Alexander the Great took his army and marched on Persia. Now, for an average person who wasn't claiming to be an expert, like Jin here is, I'm a little more sympathetic about this problem of cherry-picking with regard to the COVID virus than I am about other examples, because a lot of the data about this COVID virus is uncertain. You are getting competing statistics and competing narratives from experts. You are hearing people who should be in the know saying different things, and that's because it's a novel thing. There's a lot of things about it that are unknown. There certainly is an answer to like how lethal it is, how infectious it is, what measures can be taken to treat it and what can't, and so on and so forth. But a lot of people just don't know these things yet, including the experts, because it takes time to figure these things out. But, again, even when there's a lot of unknowns, the best way to deal with this is find yourself a consistent methodology or metric by which you're measuring all these cases, and then apply it and do the best you can. And in the case of this article, Jin is not doing that. He is citing the experts he wants, he agrees with, who give the lower numbers, and ignoring the ones who give the higher numbers, because if you get to the end of the article, he has a political agenda where he's saying, hey, they're going to destroy our economy, so this is all panic and hysteria. And as I talked about 2 weeks ago, yeah, this probably is going to destroy the economy. It's very likely this is going to push the world into a severe recession or depression. But does it follow from that there isn't good cause to be concerned and that it isn't the right decision to lock everything down? Well, no, it doesn't. But because he's so worried about his political agenda of, well, what's it going to do to the economy, he ignores and wants to downplay all the data that says this virus could kill hundreds of thousands or even 1 million people or more if we don't do anything. And that's the problem with cherry picking. And you could also kind of even say that it maybe falls into a little bit of a fallacious appeal to authority, because if you're going to appeal to experts, as he kind of does in here, you can't then turn around and appeal to only the experts you like. You've got to look at the plethora of data as to what all the experts say, and again, try and apply a consistent methodology or metric to them. And that's a lot harder to do, especially in something like this where the experts disagree, but that's the right way to do it. Now, moving on through his article, I'll try to do this quickly. He also talks about, at one point in here, the R0, or what I think biologists and doctors call the R0 value, which is a way of measuring how infectious a disease is. I think it's usually written as just R0. But what he completely fails to mention is the R0 value is a measure of the total level of infectivity of the virus. Not the level of infectivity that's just inherent to the virus, but rather this is a practical measure that includes efforts that humans are taking to counteract the virus. The point being, since we've locked everything down, the R0 value of the COVID virus is now much, much lower, where if we hadn't locked everything down, it'd be much, much higher. And of course, how infectious the virus is in and of itself is going to play a measure in that. It's not like something like Ebola, because of how it's transmitted, is almost always going to have a lower R0 value than something like the flu or this COVID virus, because it's harder to transmit Ebola. It's not an airborne virus, and it's not transmitted through the air by people like sneezing and coughing, at least as best as I'm aware. And so that's always going to have a lower R0 value. But it's very important to take that into effect, because one of the arguments he makes here is, hey, this isn't spreading so bad. It's not that big of a deal. But when he completely fails to mention the fact that the reason the R0 value is, at least from the data he cites, comparable to things like the seasonal flu or Zika or stuff like that, well, it's at least partially because everybody's locked everything down and taken steps to contain it. And if none of the world governments had taken steps to contain it, you'd see a very, very higher R0 value. And since his whole argument is, hey, we're panicking over nothing, that data is very, very relevant to what he's talking about. And that's again falling into the fallacy of cherry picking. He's citing data that supports what he's saying and ignoring or glossing over data that counteracts his argument. And what you need to do is look at all of it as much as you can. Now, there's a particularly egregious error here about a little more than halfway through the article where he's got a headline that says 1% of the cases will be severe. And in this, he cites a graph that it's not immediately clear where it came from. It says the source is ourworkindata.org. Maybe it came from the CDC. And anyhow, it's a triangle graph that shows what's likely to happen if you get the COVID virus based on things. And this graph says 81% are mild cases, 14% are severe cases, 5% are critical cases, and 2.3% of all cases died. Which, in a certain sense, that doesn't sound so bad. You look at that and you might think, oh, well, that means a little less than 98% chance I'm going to live, depending on if I get the virus, which, okay, fine. But remember what I said the title of this section is, it's 1% of the cases will be severe. What this means is, the very graph he's citing says that about 19.3% of the cases are severe. You get that by just adding the number of cases that died, the critical cases, and the severe cases. And somehow from this, he takes 1% of the cases will be severe. He offers no explanation for the discrepancy here, does no math that I can find or any other such thing. The graph he's citing literally says about 19.3% of the cases are severe or worse, and he says 1% of the cases will be severe. Now, this is an egregious enough error that nobody should take this article seriously at this point. It's hard for me to come up with an analogy to explain this better than I just did. The graph says 19.3% of the cases will be severe or worse, and he says only 1% of the cases will be severe. Now, because I try to be somewhat charitable here, the only way I can think of that you could then make an argument that 1% of the cases are going to be severe is if you also included data that said that the amount of people who are infected is significantly more than the amount of people who have been confirmed to be infected, which it certainly is. Everybody agrees on that. And so then you try and estimate how many people actually have the virus, and you kind of extrapolate from that, well, because in the United States it's like 250,000 people have it now, and you assume it's 10 times higher than that, and so that way you can get that severe case number really, really far down. I still don't think without you would be able to get it down to 1%, but you'd be able to get it lower. But if that's what you're doing, then you need to explain that's what you're doing. You don't just get to cite data and then completely contradict the data you cited without at least attempting to explain it. And even if that were his argument, that would be kind of a non sequitur or red herring, in that it really doesn't address the actual problems or concerns that the medical community has about this and why they're saying we need to take this very seriously and lock everything down. The concern isn't the number of cases that are going to be severe on a percentage case. The concern is that this virus is so infectious, it's going to spread to hundreds of thousands or millions of people, and then because our medical system isn't designed to support that many people, it's going to overwhelm the system, even if only a couple percentage points of the population needs to go get on ventilators and needs to go get in ICU beds. It's because there's going to be so many of them because the virus spreads like wildfire. And so that doesn't even address the actual counter-arguments that he would need to bring up. Now, at the end of this article, he actually tells you exactly why he's doing this. He says, and I quote, "Local governments and politicians are inflicting massive harm and disruption with little evidence to support their draconian efforts. Every local government is in a mimetic race to one-up each other in authoritarian city ordinances to show us who has more abundance of caution." And I don't want to myself get into the genetic fallacy and say because he has a political motivation for what he's writing, therefore he's wrong. That doesn't make him wrong, but it does kind of explain what's going on. What makes him wrong is all the other things he engaged in, the cherry-picking, the fallacious appeal to authority, contradicting himself, and completely misrepresenting the data that he actually cites. And that's what makes him wrong, not his political agenda. Almost everybody who's writing about stuff tends to have a political agenda. And again, this whole statement he's made is kind of just a complete non sequitur, as even given the ridiculous claims and data manipulation that he's made here, caution and taking this seriously still follows. Even if only 1% of the cases are severe, with the way this virus spreads, that would overwhelm the medical system and still lead to a lot of death, and so something still would need to be done.
But further, because he completely misrepresented the data, he didn't even establish that they're inflicting massive harm and disruption with little evidence to support their draconian efforts. There's actually a great deal of evidence to support their draconian efforts.
Now, it doesn't follow from that they're not inflicting massive harm. They are. The question is, how are we balancing the harm? What's worse, going into a worldwide economic recession or depression, or allowing hundreds of thousands or millions of people to die. That's a discussion we should be having, but he's not having that discussion. He's just saying, no, they're wrong, they're putting us into depression for no reason. Well, they're not doing it for no reason. You need to argue instead that their reasons don't hold up, that the cost-benefit analysis of locking everyone down is too costly, and it'd be better to essentially let the plague spread and let a bunch of people die than it would be to send the world into a worldwide depression. Now, I argued 2 weeks ago that I don't think that's the case, but that would at least be a more honest and legitimate discussion to have.
So I'm giving Aaron Jim my first Facepalm and Sigh award for this week, because this is an absolutely terrible article that completely misrepresents the data and uses a lot of fallacious reasoning. The guy clearly has no idea what he's talking about. It's a shame that it got spread around so much.
Okay, so for my next example, I'm going to play you a clip of Dennis Prager talking about a news conference that Trump was doing with Dr. Fauci, and he's also going through some of the issues involved here. So I'm just going to go ahead and play that for you.
If this does not turn out to be the catastrophe for which we are ruining millions of people's lives, I hope you will join me with contempt for the advice of experts. The only thing I want from an expert is information. I have no interest in your advice. None. Is that clear? I am as interested in the advice of my Uber driver as I am of an expert. These people are all idiot savants. They know a lot about a little. I have known this my whole life. We have substituted experts for priests, rabbis, and ministers. Really, we've substituted them for voodoo. Oh, the experts, the experts, the experts. You know what opened me up to it? You know what? I'll tell you, it was the secondhand smoke. That's what started it. It started it when we made a war on tobacco rather than alcohol. I wrote about it in the 80s, a gigantic piece on that. We're like losing our minds. Nobody kills anybody or abuses a child or beats a spouse because of a cigarette, but they do because of alcohol. We live in the age of morons. They're called PhDs. You get it? Most PhDs are morons. You must understand that. They're morons with doctorates. This is the test. The reliance on experts has crushed the economy of America. The president is wrong. We will rebound whenever this ends. That is not true. We will rebound ultimately after staggering damage is done to people and their lives. Now, I may be wrong. I acknowledge it. I may be wrong. There may be this avalanche of death. By the way, the avalanche of death would have to approach the flu for me to begin to take it seriously. We're not close to the flu. What was the number I just gave for America? 220. Influenza, 30,000. But the flu doesn't have a name. That's the key. This has a name, COVID-19. Yeah, play the Fauci clip.
Thank you for the question. I've heard that before. I don't connect the dots there. I don't see how testing everybody in the country is going to help you to implement this. This should be implemented.
Wait a minute. Wait. This is his answer is so convoluted, he has lost my respect. This answer wait. If we had the means to test everybody in the country, why would he oppose it? And did you notice it was a non sequitur? This will have no effect on our ability to implement. What is it? That's not the question. What if, let us say there, how many Americans? 330 million Americans? Let's say 200 million Americans are affected. Then it really isn't a big deal, is it, that 240 died or 1,000 died? If 200 million Americans have it. Isn't that correct? But if 5,000 Americans are infected and 1,000 Americans died, this is a big deal. So the number of infected is extremely important. How could you tell me not, Fauci? What's wrong with you? This is crap that he sold the American people. I have not been this angry, this prolonged in the history of my broadcast. My life is not being ruined, folks. But so many of my fellow Americans' lives are being ruined. What is he talking about? It wouldn't help if everybody were tested. Of course it would. Then we would know something. We wouldn't have to trust experts. You don't know any death rate without knowing it. Exactly correct. It's meaningless. Meaningless. Continue this
This
crap.
should be implemented universally, at least at this level for everyone. The things we spoke about a while ago, that you want to really ratchet it up, like Governor Newsom is doing in California, like Governor Cuomo is doing in New York, or how you put an end to this outbreak. Testing is important. It would be nice to know, and there are certain things you could do, but let's not conflate testing with the action that we have to take.
Why wouldn't we conflate? Of course we have to conflate them. What's wrong with you? That's a stupid comment. Of course we have to conflate. It's the only way we know if it's serious. You're lying to the American people or you're stupid. There's no third alternative. Let's not conflate the two. Yes, let's close down America, though that we don't have a clue how many people are infected. This is from Fauci, God Fauci, the great expert. The crap you are being fed, my friends, from CNN and the rest, and from Fauci.
Okay, well, I hope it's very clear right there at the end that Dennis Prager is engaging in a very clear, obvious example of a false dilemma. He says the guy's either lying or he's stupid. Well, no, there's a whole number of other options in between. It could just be that Prager's wrong, which he actually is. Because what he was criticizing Fauci for at the end there is where Fauci said, hey, let's not conflate testing with the action we're going to take, and Prager got mad and went off on him there. But really, no, I was talking to my wife about this, who, as I've mentioned before, is a doctor, is an expert in these kind of things. And what she said is, well, yeah, of course, you don't want to conflate the data of how many people have the virus with then how you're going to turn around and treat the virus, how you're going to deal with the pandemic. Now, knowing how many people have the virus is certainly in and of itself a useful thing, because it's going to better enable you to treat people. It's going to better enable you to decide, well, do we quarantine this city? Do we restrict travel here? Is it too widespread for these actions to make any kind of a difference? Those kind of things. But that's not the same thing as your actions of, well, do we quarantine here? Do we restrict travel here? I was pretty, even before I talked to my wife, I was pretty shocked that Prager didn't get this, because you can see analogies in other things. Like, I was in the Army for a while. Well, when you're engaging in warfare, military intelligence, part of it is the idea of trying to figure out, well, where are your enemy's troops? What are they planning to do? How are they defending this place here and this place here? And that's part of the job of military intelligence, is to get the commanders and the people who are ordering the battles that information so they can make better decisions. But that information that military intelligence is trying to get the commanders is not the same thing as the actual battles that will be fought, as the decisions those commanders are making. And so what Fauci was saying there quite clearly was, well, yeah, if we have better information, that's a good thing. That's going to enable us to make better decisions. But that's not the same thing as us treating people, as us finding a vaccine, as us finding treatments for this, as us quarantining things. It seemed to me, Dr. Fauci was claiming there that testing is not the be-all, end-all. It's useful in and of itself, but it's not the thing that's going to stop the virus, and it's not how the government is actually going to completely address the pandemic. It's just if we test everyone. So I hope that's a clear enough example of a false dilemma. It's where somebody gives you two and only two options when there are other alternatives available. It could be that Dennis Prager is wrong, which I just argued he is. That's a third alternative. A fourth alternative could be that he's just too angry about this to actually see clearly, which he sounded very angry, and I think he even said in the clip that he's very angry about it, so that could be the case too. I know often I don't see things as clearly as I should when I'm angry. And it is important to talk about earlier on when he was going off on experts being wrong and not knowing what they claim to know, that the experts are our new priests, our new voodoo, or that kind of thing, which in some senses that's right, but see, that's a conflation. He's pulling a type of equivocation there, where experts are wrong almost always when they talk outside of their field. That's why if you are trying to do good philosophy, you shouldn't listen to somebody like Richard Dawkins, because that's outside of his field. Conversely, if you're talking about, well, how does a disease spread and what should we do about it, Dr. Fauci's a good person to listen to. He's an expert on that. Now, if you were worried about, in the same vein, how's this going to affect the economy? Are we going to go into a recession or a depression, or how do we get out of that? Well, Dr. Fauci's not an expert in economics, so he's not the kind of person you should talk to. And part of the trouble that people are running into with this kind of thing is you have multiple vectors coming together. You've got economics, politics, medicine all coming together, and it's very rare you're going to get somebody who's an expert in all those things. So you're having experts in different fields tell you different things based on their expertise. The economists are telling you this is going to be devastating for the economy, which it almost certainly is, i.e., then we should do something different. Conversely, the medical professionals are saying this disease could kill hundreds of thousands or millions of people if we do not take these steps. Therefore, we should take those steps, and those two things seem to come into conflict. So you have experts telling you conflicting things based on the expertise they're working from. And again, not to plug myself too much here, but I think the way you try to balance that is you go back to doing, like I talked about 2 weeks ago, a type of Pascalian wager and look at the upside and the downside and try to figure it all out and balance it as best as you can. You don't just write off expertise like Prager did. Now, of course, there is something to be said for being at least a little skeptical of what experts tell you. There's a great quote I like from the Catholic philosopher Peter Kreeft, or maybe it's Kreeft. I hear conflicting things about that. Anyhow, I heard him say one time, there's a saying, that's so stupid only a PhD could believe it. And he does have a point there. PhDs do tend to be people who are very highly educated in one subject and one subject only, and don't know very much about the broader type of the field. So, like, I do philosophy. I'm pretty well educated in philosophy of religion, but if you were to ask me about, like, philosophy of AI or philosophy of aesthetics, I'm not going to know very much about those things. Now, because of my philosophical training, I'll probably know a little more than the average person who hasn't studied those things at all, but there's going to be a much better expert for you to look to on philosophy of aesthetics or philosophy of AI than me. And that just goes without saying. So if I started pontificating on those things, I'd be outside of my field, and you'd probably be better off not listening to me because I'd probably be wrong. But further, and I know this because Dennis Prager runs a whole YouTube channel called Prager University that I've watched and used before, or for various things, and I do recommend it. It's a good channel that's very informative. He cites experts on there all the time. He has people come on there who cites experts. He's engaging in that cherry-picking thing again, where he's demeaning the experts who are saying what he does not want to hear. But go watch his YouTube channel. He's citing experts all the time who agree with him. He's only complaining about what the experts say when it doesn't agree with what he wants, which is in this case that the economy is going to be devastated, which, again, it almost certainly is going to be devastated by all this. So, I'm giving Dennis Prager the second Facepalm and Sigh award this week for engaging in a very, very clear example of a false dilemma, and for demeaning expertise in the wrong way and engaging in a bit of cherry picking there, where I know from that channel that he will cite experts that he agrees with, but not the ones he doesn't agree with, apparently, as we now know from this clip. But I still recommend you check out his YouTube channel because there is a lot of good stuff on there that is very much worth your time to look at. Okay, so I'm pushing up on time here. I'm going to do this last one here. It's the most egregious example. This is an article that was published in the New York Times, and the original title was "The Road to Coronavirus Hell Was Paved by Evangelicals," although after they got some pushback, the title was changed to "The Religious Right's Hostility to Science is Crippling Our Coronavirus Response." This is written by a woman named Catherine Stewart, and you probably heard about this article. She essentially goes through and argues that because Donald Trump is supported by evangelicals, which is kind of true, some evangelicals have resisted or downplayed efforts to lock down. They've kept their churches open. One or two mega churches have done that. Some other smaller ones have. Some of the evangelicals have come out and said, oh, this is just an attempt by the the political left to come after Donald Trump, and downplayed it as well. At least they were doing that until a week or two ago when it became obvious that this wasn't something to be downplayed. And so she says evangelical Christians essentially have an anti-scientific attitude, and that's been picked up by President Trump. Therefore, evangelicals are the ones who've made this response to the coronavirus worse. And you can read the whole article at the New York Times if you like. I think I've fairly summarized it. Again, I'm not going to read it verbatim, but I hope you should see immediately right away that's a very clear example of a hasty generalization. She's assuming from the 2 or 3 examples she cites there that
all or most evangelicals have an anti-science attitude and have not locked down or resisted the lockdown or viewed it in purely political means. I can tell you, as a Christian evangelical who hangs out with other Christian evangelicals and goes to an evangelical church, that has not been my experience at all. No other Christian evangelical who I know is not taking this seriously. My dad locked down his church and started doing services online. The church my wife and I go to locked down and started doing services online. The church my wife's parents go to locked down and started doing services online. As best as I know of, every church in our community did that. I'm unaware of a single one that hasn't started doing that. Which that would mean that I now have 3 examples I know of that counteract the 3 examples she knows of. So what should that tell you? Well, hasty generalization. You can't assume just from the couple of examples that she cites that it is the case that evangelicals aren't taking this seriously and are anti-science. Likewise, you couldn't tell that just from the examples I cited either. You would need to get a whole lot more data and figure it out. Furthermore, even if she hadn't done a hasty generalization and was somehow able to establish or prove at least beyond a reasonable doubt, that most evangelical Christians aren't taking this seriously and are anti-science, it doesn't necessarily follow from that due to the fact that some of them support President Trump and he's been at least kind of seemed to be friendly toward evangelical Christianity, that in turn influences President Trump to do and say what he does and says. I don't know this for certain, but I'm personally kind of convinced that nobody really influences Donald Trump to do and say what he does and says other than Donald Trump. It's just kind of the way he is. And she even says as much toward the end of her article here. She says, and I quote, "By all accounts, President Trump's tendency to trust his gut over the experts on issues like vaccine and climate change does not come from any deep-seated religious conviction," i.e., she undermines her whole argument with that one sentence. And really what this is, I think, displaying is this author's deep-seated hatred of evangelical Christianity, where she's not even seeing the massive jumps that she's making. It's a massive jump to go from 2 or 3 examples of Christian pastors who are not shutting down their churches who probably should, to say, this is what all evangelical or most evangelical Christians do or want to do, and therefore they're anti-science. And then it's a massive jump to go from that to then say, and they're the ones who are influencing how President Trump is handling this kind of stuff. Because even if you want to make the argument that President Trump is doing things wrong, and I'm sure there's some things he is doing wrong, I don't know what they are, but that wouldn't surprise me, you don't necessarily then get to turn around and say, and it's because these people who he has a vague political connection to influenced him to do it. And people don't work that way. You don't get to establish causation that easily. It doesn't work that way. So for doing several examples of hasty generalization, I'm going to give Catherine Stewart here the last and most egregious example of a Facepalm and Sigh award. The fact that the New York Times actually had to change the title of her opinion piece based on pushback is rather telling. And not only is it a terrible argument, but it really just displays the author's deep-seated hatred of evangelical Christianity. So, to recap here, I think the lessons that you can take away from this is, don't do hasty generalization. Just because you've got 2 or 3 examples, it doesn't follow from that this whole group, this whole movement, this whole series of people looks alike. Don't do false dilemmas. Sometimes in life, it really is the case that there's only 2 options. It's really only yes or no. God either exists or he does not exist. There is no in between. But with lots of other things in life, it really is not that case. There's usually much more than 2 options, and don't let someone force you into the 2 of them. Don't engage in cherry-picking, misrepresentation of the data, equivocation, and contradict yourself, like Aaron Ginn did in his article. And if we could all avoid doing these things, hey, we'd be a whole lot better off. So since you've probably got a lot of free time on your hands, as everyone's telling me they do, study up on these things and learn how to reason and work your way through these things better. Because people are putting out a lot of fallacious garbage about the pandemic and other related things nowadays, and I hope the examples I gave you can help you learn how to think through these things better. So I do appreciate you listening. I know a lot of people are saying, oh, what am I doing with all this extra free time I have now that we're on quarantine and lockdown? I can't relate to that at all. I've got my 3-year-old and 1.5-year-old here at the house, and it's making life absolutely crazy. I'm having the hardest time finding time to even do this podcast because they're so loud. So I hope you appreciate it. As always, you can write in and let me know what you think about the podcast or anything else. Reach me for any kind of comment at theexaminelifewithphil@gmail.com. Reach out to me on the Facebook page, The Examine Life with Phil. And, stay safe out there. And check on your neighbors and your families. Give them a call. See how they're doing. See if there's anything you can do for them in the midst of this time. Because even though we're all locked down, or at least you should be locked down if you can help it, well, that doesn't mean you should actually, give up on talking to people. Give some people you haven't talked to in a while a phone call and things like that, and that'll probably help you feel better and get you through this time. I know I'm trying to do that myself. So that's all I got for this week. Write in, let me know what you think. And one final thing before I go, I do want to apologize that the audio quality of this one has probably gone up and down. I've had to try and record it in pieces as best as I can because of that 3-year-old and the 1-year-old, so I appreciate you bearing with me. So thanks again for listening. I will be back to talk to you again next week.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.